G'day legends, I hope that you're having a fantastic day. So far, a fantastic week. Now, a word of warning, I believe this video is probably going to be longer than usual, and I understand that they are already very, very long, but jump across into the Telegram as well and come and join the discussion. There are 0 people banned from the chat, so you can actually have a discussion and put your point of view across, unlike a lot of chats out there that get heavily then censored. So what are we going to speak about today? Of course, we have to look in the north. We'll update you on the maps and those shifts that we're seeing in the north, as well as some footage. We need to then put that with the maps in the east as well and see what changes we're seeing by the Russian offensive in the east. And then we'll talk about Ukrainian mobilization. We'll also talk about Ukraine's goals of joining NATO and if that is possible without regaining all the 1991 borders and what the Czech leader has said. We'll talk about an oil depot on fire. We've got better images than we had yesterday. And in the end, I want to talk about hybrid warfare campaigns and what we have seen the Kremlin release today. And we'll speak on that as a whole of that Russian hybrid warfare campaign, how that affects the West, the global South, and all of the little pieces and the cogs turning in that. And I think this is a very, very important piece of this war, not particularly say Russia v Ukraine, but Russia, China, maybe the global South v the West, and what they say is becoming a multipolar world instead of a unipolar world. But that will be at the end. So let's actually talk about the north and see what is happening. So look, we'll just jump straight onto the maps here. And of course, here's Ukraine center, the capital of Kyiv. And where we're talking about is up here between Sumy in Ukraine and Kursk in Russia. Now, as you know, we don't really use this map that much for up here, but we can see some expansion of Ukrainian control in here. But it does seem that Russia hasn't really taken the bait of the Ukrainian Kursk offensive. Because what we have seen is that Russia continue to push and push very hard in areas around New York, Donetsk, and in Avdiivka as well. And I think maybe the primary goal of this was to push into Russia, to force Russia to redeploy soldiers away from these areas to stop this Ukrainian initiative into Kursk. And it doesn't seem at this point in time that that bait has been taken. And someone in my chat said Russia and Ukraine have essentially jumped out of a plane to see who will pull the parachute first. Of course, this meaning who will have to redeploy elements first. And as we've said from the early days of this, the best defense may be offense. So I guess Ukraine opened this, an offensive action, to try and make Russia draw troops away. But what Russia has done is sort of the same action of that offense for defense, is they've pushed even harder towards Pokrovsk, which is down in this Avdiivka front. I'll show you specifically on the maps in a second, hoping to force the Ukrainian command to send troops away from Kursk so they may have an easier time then regaining that territory. Now, what we could see is we could actually see Ukraine then double down in Kursk and push even deeper, forcing Russia to potentially move more forces, or vice versa. We see Russia push even harder somewhere else to try and draw those forces as well. So we'll talk specifically on this movement down in the east and this movement up in the north, and we'll look at then the maps. Now, down in the east, we'll talk about that specifically in just a second. So what we have seen realistically over the last couple of days on the movements, the most important thing I think that's been happening, and we'll show you the movements, but is the destruction of the bridges then across the same river, which crosses right where my cursor is here. Now, there were 3 primary bridges and all 3 have been taken down. The last one was taken down just after the video went live last night. We have then a photograph of this bridge. You can sort of see the silhouette, but you're not crossing that unless you're in the bloody crusty demons. And then we have, then this is the geolocation to that bridge here. We can zoom out, of course. Here is this area. So we have Titkino, where we know there has been an incursion here. Of course, we have Sujar, areas you will be familiar with, and Kotonovo. So we presume that Ukraine is trying to isolate the Russian forces here, potentially take more POWs, or then occupy this area another 600 to 700 square kilometers that they could use as a bargaining chip for negotiation down the line. Now, speaking on bridges, we have seen then a number of Russian temp bridges or temporary bridges come up. So we have this one right here. Now, many have been questioning why into this sort of spit of land out here with bridges, where is good coming off the shore onto the bridge and off the shore may not be in, by satellite imagery, the best place anyway, it seems. So that, to my eye, and this is my geolocation, so if I'm wrong, tell me, but is just on this spit of land where there is a bridge here. Now, I would say these bridges potentially will get blown up fairly quickly. We've seen the other ones. We'll see a lot of targeting, I'm guessing, on these. And then we see a second temp bridge just here as well. Now, again, my geolocation, but I believe it's here, the end of this track. And this is right near Glashkovo. Of course, this bridge right here is the one that was taken out of the first of then those three. So let's swing across back onto the maps. We've spoken about our bloody bridges, but let's look at where Noel reports is showing any changes today. Now, interestingly, he's not showing any Ukrainian push towards Thankyou as the deep state map is in here. But what he is showing today on the change is this filling in of area near Snagnost. Now, of course, pushing further into this west area. This is the area we're speaking about that Ukraine may look to occupy these 700 square Ks, push the Russians out, isolate the Russians in here to take more territory. So just this advancement in here for today, according to then his map. Then have a look at then the Syriac maps and we'll see what changes he is showing in here. Now we have two Syriac map updates. Now he is showing this Ukrainian push into Tyantyno. So look, let's confirm that there has been a push across here. Ukraine army recaptured Snagnost. So this is the same area right in here that Noel reports is showing right in here. This is why, when you ask me, why do you show multiple different maps? Because sometimes multiple ones show very different things. It also shows an expansion of control out towards Kadanovo and out towards the northeast as well, with capturing and recapturing some areas. Again, like I say, it's very difficult to get an idea on this opposed to the east. This is highly mobile DRG elements, highly liquid, fluid front line back and forward here, opposed to, say, in the east where it's attritional grind forward, where it's a little bit easier to know, yep, bang, there is the front line due to trench line. A little bit harder up here. But then we have a second update here from Syriac, and you can see further expansion of control out to the west and in the east as well. On this Kadanovo axis, Ukraine army took control over here. So this is the Kadanovo axis up in this direction. As well as Suja axis, Ukrainian forces captured most of the locality of Martinyovka. So out from Suja down in here as well. Now, this is X area, Martinyovka. We don't see any push out there today, but these maps are showing movements. So Ukraine still has initiative and offensive maneuvers happening on this front. Now, we're going to look at what Zelensky has said and Russia's foreign minister, Sergei Lavrov, about this. But I wanted to show you this bit of footage. Now, a lot of people get stuck in, why don't you show this or why don't you show that? Typically, I show footage that is, I guess, relevant to tactic or strategic changes on things. Like we see a new weapon system come in or an important weapon system taken out. But this is said to be in the Kursk Oblast here. Now, this is a Ukrainian convoy moving down this road. Now, there's lots of claims about what this weapon system is, from glide bombs to whatever. I've seen someone call it a Jadansky, like a Russian version of a JDAM, but I am not convinced of what it actually is. Now, we're just looking at where these strikes are. Now, what we can see is the convoy moving down here, and we can see striking moving targets. Now, this is what we know has been a large problem for the Russian Air Force of being able to guide missiles, bombs, onto moving vehicles. The amount of Air Forces around the world who can actually have the capability to do this at distance real time is actually far more limited than Hollywood movies may like to tell you. Now, some are saying these are glide bombs. Now, I don't believe that to be true. You can see this isn't linear. We have seen glide bombs drop down like a linear tree line or down a road, whether it is adjacent or parallel to the plane itself. But you can see this dogleg in the road here. Now, what we have been speaking about a lot, and these are far bigger than, say, a FPV drone, is there maybe a laser guidance weapon out there, or a tornado or an Iskander, something like this, too small for an Iskander, but a weapon system that has been upgraded to some sort of laser guidance, and this drone painting those targets for moving targets. Now, a glide bomb, I guess, would be possible, but the amount of maneuverability you have just with a glide bomb is very limited. So if there's any more information about this footage and this weapon system we have come into play in the AO, please let me know. I just found it very interesting, striking on moving targets down a dogleg road. It doesn't typically fall in line with the typical GLONASS set and forget weapon systems or the linear systems as the fabs that we typically then see. So just an interesting piece. Now, Zelensky has spoken about the Kursk offensive more. Of course, Ukraine was incredibly silent on this for a good week or more, and there's been a bit more come out about this. So this is Zelensky speaking. Ukrainian warriors continue the defensive operation in the designated area of the Kursk region. As of today, force control 1,250 square kilometres. The strengthening of our position, the stabilisation of designated areas, and the replenishment of the exchange fund for Ukraine are ongoing. In general, this operation has become our largest investment in the process of liberating Ukrainians from Russian captivity. So this exchange fund, what we have seen is a lot of Russian POWs taken. Now, what he's hinting to here is how many they could actually swap back to get Ukrainian soldiers back from Russian captivity for the swap of Russian POWs. And this could work very well for Ukraine because we don't know the exchange rate of the exchange fund. Is it soldier for soldier? So could Ukraine send back a Russian conscript and get, say, a SF fighter or a trained fighter back? That said, we're not sure on that. We do see a lot of prisoner swaps where it's 10 to 15 get swapped, so we're not 100% sure. We know for officers and for pilots, yes, but as the level, how do they actually work that out? Now, just a few months ago, many people around the world, if they had heard that we were planning such an operation like the one in the Kursk region, would have said it was impossible and that it would cross the strictest of all red lines that Russia has. That is why actually no one knew about our preparation. So he's saying no one knew about the preparation into here. Now, I have seen some people question about ISR. Maybe there was some information given from US satellites across as well, but we don't have any proof of that, and we would never have any proof of that. But one of the things this has shown for many people is that Russia's red lines, that they go across into here, that a lot of those get pushed and pushed. That said, we have seen some responses in other areas to red lines. And many will say Russia has this nuclear red line of pushing into Russia. This operation versus something on Moscow may be seen very differently, but it does show that some of those red lines may be able to be crossed. Of course, this is one of the primary concerns of the West, sending in more than equipment. Now, we're witnessing a significant ideological shift, namely the whole naive, illusionary concept of so-called red lines regarding Russia, which dominated the assessment of the war by some partners. That said, it still needs to be taken into account when you're in a war with a major nuclear power. You can't just discredit all of those red lines. But this operation here has had a lot of positive messaging for Ukraine in a time when there was a lot of negative messaging for Ukraine over the last 12 months or more. Being able to make ground somewhere, to make ground in Russia itself, those red lines, and of course being back in the media in a positive sense. Now, Sergei Lavrov, of course, Russia's foreign minister, has spoken about this, that Russian President Vladimir Putin has made absolutely clear there cannot be any talks with Kyiv. The president said it very clearly that following attacks or even incursion on the Kursk region, any talks are impossible. And this is something of which we, for some reason, take, I guess, for granted. And many analysts like we sort of assume that Russia is open to peace talks at any point. Now, there has been a lot of messaging that they are open to talks, but at the end of the day, if Ukraine or the West were to come to Ukraine to the table of peace negotiations, a peace talk or whatever in November, we just assume that Russia will come to that. Now, that could be incorrect. Russia may assess, their generals may assess, no, we can have more success, and they may not actually just be open to that. So we need to get that out of our head too, that Russia is just blanket open to any sort of discussion about this. And of course, that will be made up their mind on where they see the future of the war then going and how the messaging of being open to peace talks and negotiations may go. Like I said, if I was a general and the enemy that I was fighting came to me and said, well, we want to have a peace negotiation, I would look and go, well, if for 2.5 years you have said that you're not open to any of this and now suddenly you are, you must be assessing that if we don't have some sort of peace deal that we're going to take more land. why would I then come to the table? Of course, it ends the war. Of course, massive spending, a lot of bloodshed. But again, wait and see how things go. Now, I gave you a look down at what is happening in the east of Ukraine, and I would now show you more specifically on the map. So, of course, we're out in the east. The red area is occupied since 22, the purple since 2014. The red check is area that Russia has taken within the past 24 hours. Now, what you can see here is a lot of ground being made in and around, we call it the Avdiivka front, but we'll call it the Zeleny Pokrovsk front. Now, as you can see, this area down to this reservoir has then collapsed over the past 2 days. We see 18, 19, 20 right there. As we presume, this open ground from Murmansk would at some point be too difficult to hold and may have a full withdrawal out of here. I think next we will see this portion down here, as we've spoken about, potentially fall to. Syriac is showing that today. Now, what we can see, and I think an interesting part here, is that we're talking maybe 11 Ks-ish, depending if we go grey zone, maybe more, under 11 Ks, but from the Russian front line here to Pokrovsk. Now, what I presume the Russians may be doing here is the more I think they can put pressure on Pokrovsk, the more likely Ukraine may be to pull troops out of the Kursk offensive to reinforce in here, making it easier for the soldiers that are Russian already in Kursk to take back areas there. But I have seen a lot of people going, is Pokrovsk actually the objective? Or is the objective we're seeing subtly push? We have a lot of open ground in here, as per like this open ground that we see fell quickly, or back here or in here. Are we being incorrect on that there is a push for Pokrovsk? Is this just an expansion to actually have a push to the south, take these areas and link up where Russia has been pushing very hard over the past 6 months in Krasnohorivka? And that is something interesting just to put out there if that could be happening. Now, let's talk about this. We'll jump onto then the defensive works map and have a look. Now, what you can see is this isn't updated to the same degree. Doesn't matter. The front line is down where my cursor is. But that the amount of defensive works that sit in some of these open areas are limited. But you also will massively reduce the effectiveness of some of these defensive works if you flank them. This is what Ukraine was trying to do, say, down in Robotny, was get through the Russian defensive line and then your side onto the defensive line, massively reducing its effectiveness. So, of course, these defensive lines, if these are correct here, are made for an east to west attack. But if you come a north to south, they'll be effective, but not as effective for how they are sighted in. So, do I think this will happen? Again, I don't know. I'm not a command. No one on YouTube, very, very few people are commanders of large-scale armed movements and can assess this. No one's in the head of the lieutenant general, lieutenant colonels doing this, but I thought I'd just put it out there that potentially that is what we'll see, and many people are saying that's what Russia actually are pushing for in this direction at the moment. And with the defensive works, it may be a realistic strategy in here. So let's then look at the Syriac map update and see where things are changing. Now, he shows yesterday that up to this reservoir it would filled in, and now he shows in this trap reservoir in here it's also filled in. We did speak about this a few months ago. Now we can see, oh, what have I done? Oh, whoa, here we go. Sorry, I can't use computer. We can see from Mykolaiivka, more control out here by the Russian forces, according to Syriac. So see this like quarry here that he's saying right out down into here. Again, doesn't show that, but we can see movement now to Zvetny as well. So definitely has been some large movement around here, according to the maps. This is why then we use these maps. Now we do have a geolocation that does confirm this movement down in here, or at least shows a presence of forces. Ukraine's map has showed it as not only presence, but then occupation there. So we can see that rising a Russian flag in a destroyed building here. This is then geolocated just on the outskirts of Zvetny, which is right in here. So that's how these maps move up and show different territories being controlled. So let's then have a push just to the northeast of here, another area where I believe Russia is pushing very hard to try and get forces maybe to draw out of Kursk, but it can be twofold. They can also be pushing harder, but they could also be pushing at the same amount, but that Ukrainian troops were pulled out of here to go to Kursk as well. It's something I probably should have mentioned earlier, but we did see this push into New York then yesterday, and then we see then today. So what we can see is an increase in grey zone down towards the 2014 line, which is interesting because even in the week prior, it was shown as red. So potentially some Ukrainian advancement there, or that there is not complete control of that. But it does look like the remainder of New York has come under Russian control. Now, there's some saying that were troops surrounded in here. We'll wait and see for that, because that's something that we'll see come through then the channels. Now, some say there are troops present in some outer areas and workshops in here. For the sake of 95% plus, New York has realistically come under control of the Russian forces in here. But this part in here is interesting too. Let's then line this up with a few other maps. We have then Noel Reports map in here. Now, if we can zoom in and have a look at what he is showing in here, he is showing very similar, if not then actually more control. So he's showing, if we look at where this reservoir that he's showing, basically where the grey zone is sitting is all under new occupied Russian territory, and not showing this pushback or grey zone there either. So let's then have a look on the Syriac map. Now, what he is showing is not in New York itself, but in Zalesny. I call this the New York front, but just in this area here, that there was a small Russian advancement in the vicinity of that area. Now, let's then have a look just to the north. We see from Pivnechny this push out towards then Toretsk, and we see this is confirmed as well with Noel Reports map showing this similar movement up here. Syriac showed that over the past few days as well. So let's go have a look at some other regions. Now, these are the only changes we actually see on this map today, other than Ukraine's advancement up in the north, but we'll come up into the north as well, where Russia had the incursion here, the buffer zone, and we'll see then near Hliboki that there is some territory by Syriac showing that Russia has had an advancement in here over the past 3 days. This isn't being confirmed, but we have seen an increase of grey zone in here in the last couple of weeks as well, and some mentioning that there was an increase of Russian operations, so wait out on any confirmation of that. Now we'll come down into Rozdelivka, so this is above then Bakhmut, and looking around Vimimka here, where we did say there was some advancement the other day, but what Syriac is saying is there was a Russian advancement, but they've actually had to then pull back out of here, and you can see where this grey zone was right up into here. But there was Russian army advance along the railway towards Vimimka, taking control over the train station. On the other hand, map corrections were made in Ivano-Dorivka, unable to take the adjacent hills under the control of the Ukrainian army. Russian forces eventually withdrew from then the settlement. So that there was a push out into here and a withdrawal pretty much back to where the line is sitting. Now let's push down into Donetsk again. We'll come Novomyelivka, Konstantinivka front down here, and we do have Syriac saying there is some movement inside of Konstantinivka itself today. So see this intersection, it's right down into where my cursor is by Syriac. Again, we really want a couple of maps to show what has actually been changed in here. Now, oil depot. We spoke about this one yesterday. This is the photograph I showed you. And I said, look, we don't really have a good idea because of the amount of then smoke over blurring the vision beneath this, but there's at least then one. We've got new images of it then today that this fire has spread. There's at least 3 and 3, 6, 7, 8. There's at least 11, maybe this one 12. Again, can't get a really good idea on this, but the fire has spread, taking out a number of these oil tanks here, and we can see then a huge fire raging on the oil then here. Now, this wasn't said to be new strikes. It was said that some of the fire had actually taken onto other oil tanks, and there was some explosions here as well from those drone strikes now 2 nights ago. Now, we know one of the main things that Ukraine want is, of course, joining NATO. And this is a huge element of this war, and Russia not wanting Ukraine to join NATO and NATO being on its border, although this war ended up with Finland, Sweden, whatever else in NATO. But we've always said that realistically, if the war continues, is Ukraine going to join NATO while there's a war going on? Most likely unlikely. But how does it look if there is a new border drawn somewhere? Now, this has been spoken about from the Czech Republic leader. Ukraine's entry into NATO should not be conditioned on its fully controlling its entire territory. President Peter Pavel said in an interview with Novinky in Bravo, he expects that in the coming years, Ukraine could negotiate with Russia for peace, saying, I think the full restoration of control over the entire country, so territory, is not necessarily a prerequisite. If there is a demarcation, even an administrative border, then we can take this administrative border as a temporary and accept Ukraine into NATO. The territory will control at the time. So this is going to be difficult, though, I guess, diplomatically there's going to have to be a peace agreement, and I can't see Russia having any part of that agreement of that there is any future joining of NATO if their border hasn't shifted. Like I've said multiple times, I think if Ukraine want to join NATO, they need that military action to push through, and the border needs to be at the recognised 1991 borders. But he is saying that it potentially doesn't need to be this. He talks about the division of Germany, of course, into East and West Germany. So I think technically and a legal solution to allow Ukraine to join NATO without bringing NATO into conflict with the Russian Federation. So you stop the war, you have some deal, you allow that part of Ukraine in, and then later on, you work out then the rest. That said, could Russia then invade? Are you drawing NATO back in to something? A step could be taken. Both sides realise that the war cannot be continued further. So whenever they realise the war's not going anywhere, will we see then both sides come to the table? Saying if there are any peace negotiations, we will very likely be talking about the fact that Russia will occupy part of Ukrainian territory for a long time. And from the point of view of democratic countries that claim to respect international law and the UN Charter, it should happen that we will respect the agreement between the warring parties. But we will not accept the change of international borders based on aggression. So this is where it's going to be difficult, is you have to respect the agreement between the warring parties, which is Ukraine and Russia. But where does the change of international borders then lie in here if there's something in this agreement? Now, can Ukraine join NATO if there is an ongoing conflict or a border dispute? The answer is yes, but it is extremely difficult because of if an attack on one NATO country becomes an attack on all. And Article 1 set forth in the Charter of the UN to settle any international dispute in which they may be involved by peace means in such a manner that international peace and security and justice are not endangered. So I don't know. I think if Ukraine's end of goal is NATO, and the border, it needs to have a military action to the border. But of course, it's a very difficult question because if you stop the war, border holds, you've got some sort of demarcation here for a long time. What are the other NATO countries going to feel about Ukraine joining, potentially drawing them in? And you need to take into account, if there's a negotiation, you need to take into account how Russia feel about that too, and the threat of then extending the war without Russia accepting those terms also. So that will be very, very interesting. It would be interesting to see if there was some level of demarcation here, and then the acceptance of Ukraine in without bringing Russia into that. Would then Russia continue a war? Would they restart a war? We don't know. Of course, that would be very all up in the air. And of course, it will have to do with future leaders in NATO and future leaders in Russia over the long term as well. Now, mobilization. Now, Forbes Ukraine had this. We've spoken before, and I don't understand why there isn't more emphasis on trying to mobilize more soldiers. We spoke a few months ago that Ukraine really need to mobilize now. If it takes 3, 6, 9 months to go from person on the street to soldier on the front through training pipelines, whatever, if there is to be more offensive action in 2025, that needed to start now or weeks ago. Now, Forbes Ukraine said this: the number of people booked for mobilization has approached 1 million. Currently, 930,000 conscripted Ukrainians are banned from mobilization. In a week, the number will cross the 1 million mark. These are legislative approaches to reservation of employees of enterprises. So, of course, basically what this is if you work in a critical job, like you work at a power station, then you do not have to be mobilized because you are their critical job keeping then the country afloat. And this is going to be a problem with the population due to a lot of guys who could go and fight are also in very critical jobs keeping things running. This is what we have spoken about of could there be a deployment of maybe like third line troops into Ukraine from a third party. Maybe France floated this to backfill maybe some of the more logistical type jobs in the military, or even contractors to take over some of the jobs in things like power stations to relieve more Ukrainian men to go then onto the front line. Now, details here is currently mobilization does not meet the needs of the army. Because a mobilized person is not a fighter, he'll become a fighter in 3 to 6 months. So the mobilization right now is not meeting what the army actually need. At the same time, support from international parties is not increasing and will not increase. So the deputy minister is saying the amount of support from like the West coming into Ukraine is it's definitely not increasing, and it potentially could actually go down as well. So there is this balancing of Ukraine need to mobilize, but there needs to be training and equipment available for those to mobilize. And we have heard a lot of rumors that the West wasn't prepared to send some more stuff in because Ukraine wasn't willing to mobilize, that there was this bit of butting heads about this. At the same time, he noted that Russia is not reducing the presence in the occupied territories of Ukraine. At the beginning of the year, the group of Russian Federation was about 440,000 in occupied territories. Now is 600. At the end of the year is expected to increase to 800,000. Now, we've spoken that Ukraine needs to mobilise. If they're going to have 2025 offensive, large offensive against defensive lines, it needs to be in the hundreds of thousands. And one of the things where I'm thinking, is there going to be some deal at the end of the year? Is we're not seeing Ukraine do that. We haven't seen this mass mobilisation, conscription, hundreds of thousands, tens to hundreds of thousands. We haven't seen that yet, not to that degree. And the time is ticking on doing that. According to the law on mobilisation, training and mobilisation, military conscripts who work at enterprises, institutional organisations that are critically important for the functioning of the economy and ensuring the livelihood of the population in a special period are subject to reservation. Like we've spoken about, working one of those, you may not have to then mobilise. What, of course, creates issues and shortages, and what we're seeing is the mobilisation not meeting the requirements of the military. Now, here is where we're going to step away a little bit from this and maybe zoom out slightly outside of Ukraine v. Russia. But we have discussed in length that Russia is engaged really in two wars. The hot war with Ukraine and a war with the West. And this part of a hybrid campaign, of course, of this is to rally together the global South with Russia and China at the helm and to decrease the West's influence in the world of what they are calling becoming a multipolar world as opposed to the unipolar world that the West may be used to. And we need to look at an article that's come out through Russian media today. Now, this is what I believe when Western officials say that Putin won't stop at Ukraine. I don't believe that has anything to do with military actions, tanks rolling across the border somewhere. If they did that, Russia would just get swamped by NATO. They know also, I believe they know, that they can't do that. They're struggling in this part of Ukraine. They're struggling in this part of Kursk. It doesn't hold up when an official says from Russia we're going to push into Poland, or an official in Poland or Slovakia or France or Germany says that Russia's going to threaten the border and push across here. Neither side of that holds up to realistic critical thinking. But what I say is it has nothing to do with military actions, but it has to do with Russia's influence over countries, say in Asia, and then potentially down the line influencing countries, say in the West. Now, this is done through many different ways, but a lot of it is propaganda, asymmetrical campaigns, intelligence agencies campaigns, working with also private military groups, of course then international economic groups such as, say, BRICS, and international projects as well. So we look at Uzbekistan. We spoke about the other day, Russia's funding or partially funding some nuclear power plants there, tying economic reliance to Russia itself. Now, a lot of this is facing from China and Russia into Africa and Asia, and this does appear to be having actually a lot of success. And this is why time and time again we say that if Ukraine want to have sway on Russia diplomatically, they need to get the global South on their side. And Ukraine knows. We have seen Ukraine's foreign minister, Kuleba, traveling around areas like Africa. We have seen Zelensky talk about needing to raise the global south. Now, what am I actually going on about here if you're still here? Now, this is what came out through Russian media today, TASS. And the legitimacy of this, I don't know. We're going to talk about the reality versus maybe ideals. It's that Russia offers safe haven for people trying to escape Western liberal ideals. Moscow will provide assistance to any foreigners who want to escape the neoliberal ideals being put forward in their countries and move to Russia, where traditional values reign supreme, according to a decree signed by Putin. Under the document, such foreign nationals will have the right to apply for a temporary residence in Russia outside the quota approved by the Russian government and without providing documents confirming their knowledge of the Russian language, history, or basic laws. Applications may be based on the rejection of their country's policies aimed at imposing destructive neoliberal ideals on people, which run counter to traditional Russian spiritual and moral values. The Foreign Ministry has been instructed to start issuing a 3-month visa to applicants as early as September. So happening this year, and we look at this idea of traditional values, religiosity, family, things like this. And you and I, we've been speaking at length about this from the beginning of the war. If you've followed me since the very beginning of the war, I was in Brussels speaking to some politicians, and they spoke about that Russia is trying to paint itself as, quote, the last bastion of traditional European values. And since then, you and I have spoken primarily in a hybrid warfare, unconventional warfare sense, but around operations targeting citizens and governments around the world to push this idea of this neoliberal idea of the West and the traditional values of Russia. Now let's talk about the global South and how propaganda, I guess, works. Now, firstly, let's start at propaganda. Now, good propaganda need not to lie. In fact, it must not lie. Propaganda makes good use of the lie. The right idea also be set forth in the appropriate way. The secret of propaganda is to tell the truth in the appropriate form. So is there a reduction in traditional, maybe conservative religious values in the West? Yes. So propaganda takes that truth and then sets forth in the appropriate way. And if you've been with me for the last couple of months, we've been speaking about this a lot with some of the operations around the world from Russia's intelligence service as well. That for the Putin's multipolar worldview, it offers those who reject Western legal structures the means to preserve their rule and wreak violence on the enemies. Russia's argument is that they're the bastion of traditional values embodied by religiosity, the nuclear family, heterosexuality, and loyalty to the state. The Orthodox Church pushes this out into the world too, through conservative constituencies as well. Increasingly, lurid propaganda narratives being promoted, a bastion of decadent homosexual worship of Satan, of the West. But again, like I spoke about with propaganda, is it can't just all be fake to be effective. That maybe you might see a Sam Smith, or you might see the opening ceremony, and of course that is pushed out then more and more. And this is where we have to look at the reality of what Russia is saying and the ideals, but the ideals and reality may be on the other side, on the ultra progressive side as well. The disparity of resourcing and attention paid to Ukraine or Gaza as compared to Tigray, for instance, has left a strong and bitter sense across Africa and across a lot of areas in the world as the hierarchy of Western concerns, and this idea of Western sort of supremacy as well, that people feel is very, very hypocritical. Similarly, the apparent contrast of Western language rhetoric between how it described the destruction of Aleppo or Mariupol and how it excused Israeli operations in Gaza leave many on the continent perceiving a gap between Western rhetoric about values and the values practiced by those who have for so long imposed constraints on policies of African states to enforce value-based norms. The language used when rejecting Western security assistance in favour of Russia is almost always that of sovereignty. Now, continue on here. In this context, Russia is exploiting a rich opportunity to build new friendships, and in doing so, set up challenges for the West. Through persistent instability, Russia can push migration into Europe, creating the conditions for special services to pursue political destabilization. Now, I'm not saying that Russia is pushing the migration stuff across, but what we can see is, obviously, look at the UK. Migration is a very, very hot topic pushed by particularly one side of politics that creates a massive rift between the two. Now, what I'm speaking about is Russia of course, trying to be the bastion of these European values and trying to paint the West as this sort of neoliberal, Satan-worshipping, loss of values state as a whole. Now, with any propaganda, you know that I talk about, it has to be some truth and then it pushed forward from multiple angles. And I believe that this has been helped by 4 primary things. Now, first and foremost, and these are in order of the most effective on this, is, like I said, all propaganda has an element of truth. The West has shown that it has abandoned a lot of traditional systems, religion, values, and a hypocrisy towards events, as well as a historical guilt put upon its citizens. Now, these, of course, are used and greatly exacerbated by state-backed media in other countries or intelligence groups. But does it exist? Yes. Otherwise, those groups would not have any success with this. And many traditional conservative thinkers are basically seen as extremists. Look at the reaction you'd get if you question the war on gender, say, or migration into the West. If you question it, if you have a different opinion to those in power and the media there, have a look at the response to that. You'll be painted as an extremist of the highest sort. Secondly, on this, is Israel and Gaza and the response here, and how the West see it, and how the South see the West seeing this. And we'll show you a few maps on this. So, look, let's have a look at Israel, Gaza. Now, as you can see in here, now this is just for the world voting on then a humanitarian truce. But what you can see is the majority of the West have either abstained or no, where the majority of the global South, including your big hitters like China and Russia, most of Africa, most of the South, is in the yes. So there has been this, I think, has pushed this forward a decade as well. Now, number 3 here, that has actually sped this up, I believe, is the sanctioning of Russia. And Russia was desperate then for the export of its products to maintain their economy. They were desperate to find other markets. Therefore, countries in the border of Russia, say in the global South, in Asia, then they found a friendship there willing to sell these products to those markets for cheap. And no matter where this war goes, those markets aren't just going to be turned off. Once the pipeline's in, once there's an agreement, terms, money, power plants, whatever, this is long term. And I believe that may have sped this up as well. Does that mean not do it? No, it just means every action has a reaction as well. Now, another thing here is, of course, number 4, and I believe the least actually influential here, is actually Russian intelligence operations and their hybrid warfare campaign. Very effective, but I believe it's only using those other first 3 as a sort of as a springboard to push those narratives more, not creating those all itself. Probably the most successful in here is their hybrid arming and training of Iran and its proxies, which of course links back into number 2, of course, being what we've seen in Israel and Gaza. Now, I said a few things in this. I said about Ukraine needing to get the global South. They want to have diplomatic pressure on Russia. So let's have a look at countries that then signed the peace communique in Switzerland for Ukraine. Now, as you can see, the countries we expected, yes, in the yellow, but they're not the countries that have the pressure on Russia at the moment. They've already sanctioned Russia. They're already demonized everything here. You need to raise the global South. They're the ones still have those friendships and can have more effect on Russia. And it did fail. I know there's a few countries that are incorrect on this because after this have signed or have had conversations about it, but as a whole hasn't risen the global South to come to Ukraine's aid in this. And we can see even greater when we come to the sanctions. You can see that EU, North America, Australia, yeah, but the majority of the global South has not sanctioned Russia. Now, some of those are seeing to the sanctions. Do they give a shit about the sanction? No. But what they're saying is, I think Indonesia's a good example of this, is, hey, we can buy oil at the sanctioned price because it's fucking way cheaper. But are they a sanctioner themselves? No. So this is what I speak about building those relationships. Something else I think is not spoken about enough and should be concerning. I guess not concerning enough for me to go out and have children, but with my illness, I'm in a weird spot. But these are the countries in blue which are not meeting replacement rate. Countries in red are meeting replacement rate. Now, interestingly on this, you'll see both Russia and China are not meeting replacement. Russia has a real problem with the amount of births they have. So does, of course, North Korea and Japan, and so does the Western world. China, we presume, has been lying about some of the birth rates, so it's hard to actually get a grasp. But what I'm saying is here, the majority of the Global South is meeting replacement rates, and China and Russia are attaching themselves economically to a lot of these countries as well that may buffer that in the future. Particularly, I mentioned Uzbekistan before. Uzbek has a very, very high birth rate. Now, I speak about bastion of ideals, bastion of values, both sides of this, that the West has lost some of its values. Russia is saying that they have those values. Is that realistic? Well, many people see ideals and not reality. So we'll talk two sides of the coin here. The gaze for Gaza. That ignores the reality of Gaza, but has built an ideal of what it actually is like there. In the same note, let's say your typical, right-wing traditional values, freedom of speech, anti-censorship, they may see ideals rather than the reality of what Russia has put forward. That I could happily sit here and criticise the hell out of the Australian Prime Minister Albanese all I want, and realistically, will I get a knock on the door? Probably not. If I was in the UK, that could be very different. But the greatest example of seeing an ideal rather than a reality, I believe, is socialism, communism. Now, of course, we know the reality of that killed tens of millions of people around the world and starved even more. Yet, well, if you want to see an example of this, look at North and South Korea. Started the same place, one system, other system. Let's look at what it is today. But what we still see, of course, is in many university campuses in the West, we will still see at protests or whatever, hammer and sickles being flown, or stickers on computers, which is funny, putting a hammer and sickle on an Apple computer, always amazing, and a lot of Marxist ideology because of the ideal of these versus the what is realistic. And that is, I think, the same with, if you were to actually take Russia up on this, of all these traditional values and go and, right, well, I'm against censorship, I'm against this and this, holy shit. The problem is you don't have all these ideals you would want, or all the realistic of this in any country you're in. And there's a really good part in this book here about then the reality, say, of the Soviet Union. That they're talking about then these people that came to Moscow in the 20th century under, of course, the Soviet Union. That these were the earnest advocates of humane killing of cattle who looked up at the massive headquarters of the OGPU, later the KGB, with tears of gratitude in their eyes, earnest advocates of proportional representation who eagerly assented when necessity for dictatorship of the proletariat was explained to them. And then we continue on that they would see a more ideal of it than the reality here, that they look up at the ramshackle tenements. These are like crowded mining dongers, if you know what that is in Australia, like what is the word, like accommodation. But if only we had something like this in England. The almost unbelievable credulity, which again, credulity means like to believe something that isn't true, of these mostly university-educated tourists astounded even Soviet officials used to handling foreign visitors. So even the Soviet officials, like, holy shit. So what I'm saying in here, make a long story short, is there's reality and an ideal, and how this is being pushed forward onto the world as well. Will we see this succeed? I think, in regards to the war in Ukraine, I think Russia and China are having a lot of success with their hybrid warfare campaigns, painting the West of this, because of the West and how they come to the table and present themselves on a global way, and even in a very local way as well. And a lot of this has to do with all of our politics, and what a very, very small amount of people in the society somehow have such a massive, massive effect. And if you want to look at ideals versus reality, we see so many people that almost yearn for like the Soviet Union, from uni students through to people who don't know. If you just want to get an idea, this Master and Margarita, read this, you get an idea and how all this was hidden for so long. Anyway, legends, Probably lost most of you at the end, but have a fantastic day, and I'll speak to you tomorrow. Thank you. Bye-bye.